Hello everyone, and welcome to our In Focus BU webinar, Behaviour and Wellbeing. My name is Marie Kirkwood, and joining me are Nikki Edwards, Sandy Clark, and Shona Doyle. BU is a national initiative led by Beyond Blue in partnership with Early Childhood Australia and Headspace, and is funded by the Australian Government. BU aims to transform Australia's approach to supporting children and young people's mental health in early learning services and schools. Our vision is that every learning community is positive, inclusive and resilient, a place where every child, young person, educator and family can achieve their best possible mental health. BU is a collaborative learning community for educators who are supporting the mental health and wellbeing of children and young people. Being part of this community means your early learning service or school has access to the BU consultants to assist you in your learning and action. So is your school or service registered with BU? If you haven't already registered, do so for yourself and your service today. Participate today in our online learning community to learn and be inspired by the ongoing process of embracing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander pedagogy, ways of being, knowing and doing to focus on and make mental health matter. I'll hand over to Nikki now, who will be doing the acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Marie. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from all the lands on which we gather today, to not only acknowledge, but also pay my respects and the respects of my colleagues to elders past, present and future, and all those who continue to hold the memories, traditions and ways of being for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We recognise the importance of the continuing connection to culture, country and community, to the health and social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families. It's never more important than now to tune in and turn to country and cultural ritual for reconciliation, healing, recovery and the togetherness of community. Throughout today's webinar, we invite you to consider how the ways that we can support educator and family wellbeing are informed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' perspective and pedagogy. Thank you. Shona's going to have a little conversation with us about self-care.
So we're all here today to consider, learn and reflect about early childhood wellbeing and education. On our screen are the BU ways for today. Remember, look after yourself is very important. A sense of safety is the most foundational requirement for positive mental health, a sense of security and for forming relationships. Helplines will be posted in the chat throughout this webinar. Please use them to talk to someone if you or someone you're with are experiencing difficult feelings. Sometimes unexpected feelings can emerge, even difficult ones, so be aware of feelings that come up for you today. And make sure you talk to someone if difficulties or difficult feelings occur. Have a yarn. A safe environment means people are safe to be who they are able to work to their strengths and express their opinions and beliefs, and that they feel heard and respected even when there are opposing views. Children learn from what adults around them do, and being aware of how to look after ourselves and support each other can make a huge difference to each of us, and to the well-being of our team and to the children in our care. Children build a picture of who they are by observing adults and modelling what they do. So during the webinar today, there will be the opportunity for you to reflect on your own practices through polls and reflective questions. Please remember to take care of yourself today as we go through this webinar. Thank you. Now I'll introduce Sandy, who will take you through some of the tips for getting the best out of this online space today.
Thanks very much for that, Shona. Yes, look, just some technical tips to maximise your learning online today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the webinar platform, this is what your screen will typically look like, with the webinar viewer on the left and the control panel on the right. You can use your control panel to manage your phone or your computer audio. Today, everyone's placed in listen-only mode and your microphones have been muted as we've got a very large number of attendees here. The control panel has a text box which you'll see highlighted in blue. The responses in green are public responses and the ones in red are private responses. Throughout the webinar, you can ask questions using the webinar function. Technical support is available if you're experiencing any other difficulties at any time. So please note the customer care details that are on the screen and just contact this team directly. In the webinar today, we encourage you to get involved as much as you feel comfortable. It's important that everyone feels like this is a safe space to learn and that everyone's contributions matter. We invite you to participate in the polls that we'll be launching throughout the session. And you can also ask questions via the question box, and we hope to respond to as many queries as we possibly can during today's session. But for those that we don't get to, we will follow up after the event concludes. At this stage, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the team in the background behind the scenes. We have Dino, Steph, Juanita, Susan, and Emma. They will also be involved with posting links to resources or references that we use in the content. You can copy these if you go, just as we go, if you would like to, but please don't worry if you miss them. You'll find that there's also a downloadable handout, which you can find on the control panel. This has all the links, and it also has some reflective questions that you might like to consider with your team. After the event, all participants will be able to access the certificate of participation and a recording of the webinar. And just as a final notice, that we're making the attendee list public for you now. So I'll move back to Marie to introduce the focus of today's session.
Thank you, Sandy. Today we'll be exploring children's behaviour and wellbeing through the lens of the BETLS observation tool. We'll be discussing how does a child or young person's behaviour indicate a concern with mental health and wellbeing, how observing children and young people can deepen our understanding of their wellbeing, and how the BETLS observation tool can support educator wellbeing. So all behaviour has a meaning. Many of us are familiar with the iceberg analogy, where the part of the iceberg we can see can represent the behaviour we see. And the part of the iceberg we cannot see represents what might be motivating that behaviour underneath. Nikki, what does it mean for you when we say all behaviour has a meaning?
Yeah, I guess what we wanted to make sure that we launched into today was the concept of behavior being everything about us. We're always behaving. We don't want to limit our thinking about behavior to be about just challenging behaviors or behaviors that we find confusing or we don't understand. So that's why we want to use that iceberg analogy, is to think about, all behavior is communicating something. Sometimes it's communicating something that's external that we're not aware of until we see the behavior. And if we're not thinking about it in the iceberg analogy, sometimes we misconstrue, the behavior based just on what we can see. So I guess what we want to launch into is thinking about having that perspective and perception of behavior as being we're doing it all the time, and we want to be able to think what's underneath the water, what's underneath that tip of the iceberg, and not necessarily to make assumptions about what we're seeing.
So how does a child's behaviour indicate to you when there might be a concern with their mental health and wellbeing?
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? We spend so much time with children, so we start to know what their tips of the icebergs generally look like. Most of us have, normal patterns of being, in the sense of we're predictable, or at least people who know us and know us well and take care of us, understand that behaviour and it's not unexpected. But sometimes our responses can be changed and modified. As an example, we're in a pandemic situation, or epidemic at least, here in Australia, and children might be having different responses to their normal ways of being right now. They might be having responses in regard to feeling that sense of crisis or anxiety, or just change in routine. Their life might look so different. So and I guess that's what we're thinking about, is when we then become concerned. So it's often when it's unpredictable or it's a change in the way that children usually behave, you know, their usual ways of being. So we know, though, that behaviour can change in response to a crisis or to a change, you know, something shifting, but it can actually return as well. So it doesn't mean that the way that they're now behaving is the way they're, you know, now going to behave from here on out. It just depends on what our windows of tolerance are, you know, how long we're exposed to the change or the difficult times, and then we can actually return to our previous ways of being. So once again, we want to remind ourselves not to, as the adult, not to panic and not to make assumptions, but to just say, to notice it, you know, to notice that we think there's been a shift and a change in what's happening.
Yeah, you've made some good points, Nikki, around behaviour as our usual way of being and the patterns that we notice, and when those patterns might be disrupted. So I think that really emphasises why doing observations is so important, not only for the ways of being, but also when there might be concerns presented. So
yeah,
we're going to do we're going to do a poll to start off today with asking you a question about why do you take observations? Is it to inform planning, keep a developmental record, you have curiosity about the development or behaviour of a child? It's part of your job, or all of the above. So if you could select one or many of those, and we can have a look at those results in a moment. So Nikki, why do you think observing children deepens our understanding of their behaviour?
I think one thing that comes into play when we're able to take observations in a professional sense is that they allow us time. Like the biggest thing I think of as a professional for myself is the time that we're gifted through taking observations. So, you know, the way that we think about that is not having to know necessarily to be solution focused or think about behavior as if it's an equation, A plus B equals C. So, you know, therefore I'm going to respond this way. So I think the beauty of observations for me has always been that gift of time, that you're collecting observations, things you've noticed over time, so that you can actually, put your professional wisdom on those, share with others. So, you know, it's that beauty of not needing to know right away.
Yeah. And so do we have our poll results yet? Here we go. So all of the above shot through at number one with 91%, which is really, really interesting because it very much does encompass all of those areas. It is part of our job as part of the regulations and national law, but also that curiosity, developmental, and to inform our work. So Sandy and Shona, what are your thoughts about why we observe children's behaviour?
Look, I think it's important to recognise just how critical the role of observation is. It sounds simple, but it's actually not. And educators really have a unique opportunity to objectively observe what's going on for a child. I think we also have to remember that the scope of the observations and the professional boundaries, because it's not the role of the educator to diagnose or to label or to treat mental health issues or conditions. And I was reminded, actually, there was a recent BU Facebook post which had some information about anxiety, and it reinforced that, saying that as an educator, it's not your role to diagnose a mental health issue. What you can do is notice children or young people who might be experiencing anxiety and act appropriately, which is so true. So in collaboration with colleagues, I think those first steps are critical, trying to notice, inquire and provide support. What do you think, Shona?
Yeah, I think they're very useful in, when you're observing the behaviour of the children, and especially when there are changes in the community. I mean, we've had the bushfires, and right on the back of that, we've had the coronavirus. That will affect children's behaviour because they sometimes don't understand what's going on. They're just getting the snippets of the news, and they become really anxious, and that comes out in their behaviour. Children learn how to behave just like they learn any other skill, and sometimes what they're feeling doesn't come out appropriately, and it's our job as educators to understand what's happening for them. They're feeling overwhelmed, they may be stressed, they're anxious, it could be that they're tired, withdrawn, all different changes that can happen for children. And get that support from your colleagues, consult with your colleagues, leaders, and the families if you're unsure if what you're witnessing is a negative change in behaviour, or if you think the child in your care needs extra support, consult with the relevant leaders in your early learning service, and consider using the BU mental health continuum to recognise where you're sitting on that continuum and where that child might be sitting on that continuum. As Nikki said earlier, behaviour isn't constant, it changes. You can be fine one day, anxious the next day, very overwhelmed the next day, and how we react as educators brings that child back. So, using that and using the BETLS observation tool on the website is an excellent way to collect information and observations on children.
Shona, I was just going to follow up about what the BETLS observation tool actually is. It's you can find it on the BU website, but it is an acronym to think about behaviour, emotions, thoughts, learning, and social relationships.
Social relationships, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So if we're looking at, no. I think we get very used to calling it the BETLS chart.
Yeah, we do. We do.
But it's a fantastic tool, and it's an information gathering tool. So it's for guiding, further discussion and decision making to support a child's development and well-being. And once again, I think emphasising that it's not a diagnostic tool.
No.
But it does give us a really good framework for really respectfully recording our observation of children's behaviour, and it helps us to think about what might be motivating that behaviour and how that behaviour influences areas of a child's life. I think it's also good for educators to use to think about and reflect about their own reactions to children as well. And I guess the last place for it is that I really love the fact that it has a strengths-based focus to it.
Of course,
strengths-based approach to it. Yeah.
Lovely, thanks, Sandy.
I was just going to say that too, Sandy. Like we've sort of indicated some of the difficulties that we might have with understanding behaviour, and I'm so hesitant to call it challenging behaviour, but for the most part that's what we've talked about, the noticing being about in observations. But the BETLS tool is also for us to be able to start to observe children doing well, functioning well, having a really great social situation, when there's been great successes for them as well. So it gives us the ability to also observe what we maybe did well as educators, and also what children are doing well. And I don't mean when they're behaving well, when they're being good children. I mean, when something goes really successfully for them, when they interact with a friend and a peer and it goes really well, and why did it go so well when sometimes it doesn't? So it sort of gives us the opportunity to collect that type of information as well, which fits with that strength-based approach.
Yeah, we sometimes forget that behaviour can be on one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum too, don't we, when we're observing children. But yeah, good point, Nikki. Thank you.
Thank you, panellists. And that brings us to our next points about thinking about how observing children has supported our practice. We've all been educators previously in varying roles. So if panellists wanted to share as educators, what observations might have supported your practice?
Yeah, I had an example that I would like to share, if I can jump in. When I think about a time when I was an educator and observation really supported me in my pedagogy, it was when I was working with a child who I'd known since he was an infant, and he was now in the kindergarten room, so he was 4. So I knew him very well, but I was having a hard time convincing my colleagues that some of his behaviour was what I considered to be help seeking. I'd observed it over time, and I felt that he was really clearly help seeking in really non-functioning, disruptive ways. So that's probably why my colleagues were having a challenge with it. But and I just couldn't work out how to convince them that this is what was happening, and then therefore we should interact and respond, in as if he's help seeking, and as if that was really clear to us. So I created observations over time around what happened before and what happened after, because I really wanted to try to work out what need he had and how he was looking to have that met, so that I could share that with my colleagues. I really think he was trying to play with so and so. I really think he was becoming frustrated that it wasn't working, and at that point we could have stepped in to be some hands above and help. So and it was really successful because I had those recorded observations over time. They were really structured, and they did show the before and what happened before the incident or the challenge, and then what happened after. And it was a really successful way to develop my pedagogy to actually meet this child where he was at. So I always think of that as a successful observation story.
Thank you, Nikki. Shona, do you have anything you'd like to share?
I do actually. I found that taking observations supported me in my professional resilience, and it gave me a way to demonstrate to parents and to my colleagues the child's development and some of the wellbeing strategies we could share and practice together when we were facing challenges, just like Nikki. So yeah, it really gave me a great insight into what was happening for the child and be able to share that appropriately.
And Sandy, how about yourself?
Look, I did have a few anecdotes or occasions when I was aware that reflecting on my observations had really led me to seek more information and to talk with colleagues, to think about new strategies and changes to my practice. But I decided to choose actually a very recent example from my role as a BU consultant. When I introduced the BETLS tool to a service, and they were actually all working through it. And I noticed that once everyone was using the tool, they started sharing a really different conversation about the children, which was much more focused and less anecdotal. And I think that's really reinforced other comments I'd heard back from educators who've been using the tool, that it had really prompted them to think about the underlying reasons for the behaviour and to look more closely at the strengths of the child.
Lovely, thank you. So the BETLS tool does support our observations, as Sandy has mentioned, and she also shared previously what BETLS actually means. So it supports our observations, but it also provides us with a tool for having conversations with our colleagues and families. Through the BETLS tool, we can collect and record information in those 5 broad areas. So the behaviour, what the child is doing, emotions, what the child might be feeling, the thoughts, what the child might be thinking, learning, what learning areas are being affected, and what social relationships are being affected.
Yep, it is a really consistent tool for everyone to be using when you want to document evidence in a reliable and consistent and very objective manner. That's something that we will go into a bit later on, though. Sandy?
Yeah, because the BETLS tool also really asks you to think about and to consider what strategies have been used. So, who's implemented them and what's What's the outcome? And this is a really good to record over time, because you end up with a record of different things that have been tried. You can think about progress, and you can use it to evaluate your strategies as well. I think following on from what Shona said, it's also you have to record what other people have noticed. Just remembering that it's not possible to understand what's going on for a child following a single observation just by one person. And really a different set of eyes can bring a new perspective and new information. But it also gets us to consider other factors, like are there cultural factors to consider for this child? Are there any recent changes in the child's life or at the service? And just being aware of these factors can bring up other options for support. I think that's particularly applicable at the moment too, given that children will be returning to services, to schools, following some time away as well, and have experienced quite different situations, and they will be experiencing quite different responses too.
Mm. Thanks, Sandy. I think that's it's really clear that the tool is very thorough. And I think I just wanted to make a point here of thinking around the connections that we make to perhaps to something like trauma-informed practice, which, or you know, the basics of that. And the thing that is really important about BETLS is, while the first thing it asks us is, what is the child doing? Which, as Shona has already identified, the intention of that is to be really objective. The BETLS tool then beautifully doesn't cut out the skill and knowledge and experience that educators have. So, and which can be cut out sometimes in observation systems. So, and it actually does ask you, like it says, what might, and just the word might leaves us, you know, open to that idea of, you're not always going to know, but with really good intention, putting your skill, you know, and your pedagogy to that observation, you're going to have a think. You're going to say, it could be, and like, how will we know? And of course, that's when you obviously want to be able to share that, because you don't want to be just thinking about it yourself, coming up with the answer yourself, but actually, you know, talking to your colleagues and saying, I've noticed this. What have you noticed? Well, you know, and to my mind, that sits really beautifully with trauma-informed practice, because so often in our day-to-day work with children, we don't know. There are so many things we don't know, and as much as often we'd like to know them, we'd like all the context and all of the systems and how's this impacting that. Sometimes we don't know, and we don't actually need to know in order to be really good responsive educators. You know, to be able to be really curious, professionally curious, you know, and really wonder about what's happening there. So I do think that's, you know, an important piece to put on top of BETLS, to know that it's actually asking you to make really good use of your skills. You're not cut out by using this chart. You're actually put deeply right into the middle of it, and you need to put your skills and knowledge onto that. So yeah, and it's okay not to know. You know how we sort of have that feeling like we want to be the one to work out what's under the iceberg, but we're not always going to work that out. But what we are going to do is, with good intention, use the BETLS tool, because that's really important. What our intention is when we use the tool is to deepen and develop our understanding, so we can be responsive in the best way. And sometimes we're going to think it's something, and it may turn out not to be. That's okay, because we've, with really good intention, tried to work it out. So yeah.
I agree with you, Nikki. I think it does, that the tool does really honour educators' skill and expertise, and what we see throughout it are prompts to actually bring forward that knowledge. So it does continue to look at some areas about pervasiveness, frequency, persistence, and severity too. So Pervasiveness, thinking about when and where does this occur? Is it across one setting or across multiple settings? And what about the time of the day? Who's present at the time and what's happening before, what's happening after? The frequency is about how often the behaviours, the emotions and the thoughts are observed. So that might be, you know, just occasionally. And you know, thinking about maybe something is happening at that time to trigger it off. It might be all the time or at specific times. And I think this all highlights this, maybe if the environment or the routines need to change, or maybe a child needs support with further strategies. And we might find that it's perhaps always happening at a transition time, or maybe in a large group setting. The idea about persistence is really about how long has the behaviour been happening for. Is it always just in the setting where you are? Has it just started? Has it built up over time? And finally, the severity was the last one I had referred to. It's about how severe these emotions, thoughts and behaviours are, you know, are mild, moderate or severe, and how they're influencing a child's day-to-day experience. You can understand in terms of how the child is behaving in relation to other children of the same age. And I think educators are really well placed and experienced in understanding all of this. So that these things combined really just help to give us a clearer picture of what's happening and what's going on.
I love these 4 points, and it because it does fit with that idea of, you know, developing our understanding over time. There's no sense of rushing in or needing to know. So, and I think the point, I love the point that you made about, you know, how it influences the child's day-to-day experience, because that fits again with that idea that we can change from day to day, moment to moment, depending on what's happening around us and how the ability we have to cope and respond to that. And it reminds me that we don't, you know, resilience is built by sometimes having a hard time. Sometimes, you know, you have a hard time. So it's not our job as educators to solve or eliminate hard times. It's about, you know, supporting children when they're having them, to understand them and to know how to recover from them. But also that sometimes you're just actually going to stay in them. You know, it's okay to stay in being angry and frustrated or embarrassed or whatever the harder or, you know, feeling is that you're having. And it reminds me that we all, our functioning is affected differently. Like for some of us, we can function really well with really hard emotions over time, and we operate well under stress. I'm thinking about that in an adult sense, obviously, but some of us not. So we shouldn't, as educators, assume that a child who's having a hard time is not functioning well. Like they don't necessarily correlate with each other, that they're you know, therefore having a terrible time of life because something's hard right now. And we only know that by knowing the children, because without knowing the children well, like how do we know when this child's reached their threshold, like they're not coping or managing or regulating now, they're somewhere else. So I really love that the BETLS tool allows us that, you know, to pick up on, once again, something that happens over time, not a one-off that we then, you know, decide our programming or our interactions around.
I love that, Nikki, and it reminds us that as educators that we provide that safe space for children to fail now and again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
I was thinking of the word acceptance, like accepting feelings, you know, naming them, acknowledging them.
Yeah.
And that's part of why we want to identify all behaviour has a meaning, is because we don't want there to be negative behaviours and positive behaviours, because they're actually all just behaviours that, you know, healthy, whole people feel. So
yeah. So in reflecting together, the BETLS observation tool, it has a section for looking at the behaviour from the educator's perspectives, and it gives an opportunity for reflection. So it gives you an opportunity to ask what additional support you may need, and ask yourself, do you fully understand what's occurring for the child here? And if not, what can assist you with gaining this understanding, and what can support you in that journey? Using the reflection tool that's available on the website is a good way, because it has some really good prompting questions for that. Discussing with your colleagues who knows the child a little bit better, or has taken another observation, and compare those observations together. Together you can come up with a picture maybe of what's happening, and you can help your colleague and yourself to explore your own feelings about this behaviour. So using that reflection tool as a starting point can develop comfort with the complexity of some situations. It will assist you as a service and as your team to support your own well-being through this, which really is a great aspect of that BETLS tool.
Thanks, Shona. I have an example I'd like to share from working with services using the BETLS tool. And the story I was told that after reflecting together, the educators identified that the child that they had these concerns about didn't really have and wasn't really experiencing any positive relationships with any of their educators. So when those educators were reflecting together and, knowing that positive relationships are a protective factor for children's mental health and wellbeing, they made a decision to make sure that that child could have one warm, trusting and nurturing relationship with, at least one educator to support them, that secure base to go to. So they used that risk and protective framework to inform those decisions about what to do next. So they were focusing on what they could enhance and have influence over. But furthermore, they also recognised the importance of each other's well-being when putting this strategy into place. So, when working with this, with the educator working with this child, it was to support that educator at the same time if they started to really struggle with what was happening, or feeling really challenged, that other educators would be in tune, I guess, with that educator to almost tap in and let that educator step out for a little bit to regulate themselves as well. And that eventually became a bit of a cultural norm at that service as well, where that was just the standard of practice across the educators. Yeah.
That's nice, isn't it? It takes a certain amount of preparedness for that, because it's something that you want to have discussed and shared and agreed on before you have that moment. So, which once again is what observation allows us to do, is to be prepared for our own triggers or challenges, and the things that we find more difficult to be present for. So and it's nice that service is working in such a non-judgmental, safe way to actually recognize that, educators have well-being as also. We also have well-being needs, and that it's you're still a professional if you identify that you're having a challenge or that you need help. You're seeking help in the same way. So I think that's really lovely. I think that would make a big difference for a lot of people if they had that already, agreed upon, that, sometimes I reach here and I want to be present, but I need to be mindful. And once I've been mindful, I'll be back and be able to be my best self again.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we do all acknowledge that children's behaviour, does impact on educator wellbeing. But today we really want to look at how the BETLS tool can support educator wellbeing. So for our second poll today, we are asking, how do you build your professional wellbeing? You can choose as many as you wish from the following, which are relationships and partnerships, confidence in my knowledge and skills as a professional, knowledge of policies and procedures, children's behaviour, and leadership support. So some questions we might consider, I guess, and this is for the panelists to consider as well. Has your professional wellbeing ever been impacted by misunderstanding a child's behaviour? And have you ever at one point taken a child's behaviour personally? And what might influence your response to a child or young person's behaviour? Panelists, do you have any responses to those questions or anecdotes you'd like to share?
I just want to say yes, 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 and yes.
Yes, I think your cultural background also expects the way that you were brought up to have children behave and in a certain way. And when they don't, you may take that personally as a reflection on the way that child feels about you. But you then have to put that aside and explore the child's cultural background. You know, how are they brought up? What does it look like in their household? So that you don't take it personally and you do act very professionally.
Mm. Mm.
Such a good point, Shona. I was just thinking when you said that about cultural ways of being around things such as respectful, what's identified as respectful behavior. You know, for
Yep.
example, making eye contact. Culturally, for me, you know, making eye contact, you know, is incredibly important to show that I'm listening and being respectful. Of course, you can make eye contact and not be actively listening to somebody at all, but for whatever reason, that's something that I've carried with me. So, you know, I often think that a child is not respecting me if they're not showing me those sorts of behaviours.
Yeah, and another one is, you
I
know,
can
if you
unpack
put your
that.
hand,
I know it's
yeah,
true, but yeah.
yeah, put your hand on a
Yeah.
child's head just to let them know you're there and they flinch away from you. You take that personally, but in their culture, it may not be appropriate to be touching them on the head.
Mm. Mm. Okay, our poll results are in. So relationships and partnerships is the top response at 93%. But all of those responses are quite high anyway, so which is important too. So we're going straight into our final poll for today as well, which is, how do you ensure your own well-being when you engage in difficult conversations with families or colleagues? What do you do? Do you make sure you're prepared, maintain professional boundaries, debrief after with an appropriate person, engage in mindfulness strategies, or other self-care strategies? So ensuring your own well-being when having difficult conversations may be very different depending on who you might be talking with. It's important to make space and time for expressing those expressing distress or feelings in safe and appropriate ways. Reflecting about and planning for what you could do next time, and for practicing self-compassion. As challenging as it can be at times, we also need to be careful about taking those things too personally, as we just had a discussion about before.
Yeah, and I have an example of that where an educator felt distressed and anxious for several months after sharing a recorded observation with a parent. The child was around 18 months old and had started to demonstrate some concerning behaviours. And the educator had recorded these and shared them with the parent appropriately. But the parent had not accepted these observations and accused the staff member of bias and just withdrew the child with no notice. Now, maybe if the educator had approached the parent with observations taken by different staff members at different times of the day, perhaps some of this anxiety would not have occurred for her, because You know, it was a different approach in practice, and it would have avoided this, and it would have avoided the accusations of bias, because maybe the the observations of other educators would have confirmed that for the family, or it could have even just made the educator think again, well, am I putting this observation there and it doesn't really fit that child? So the educator's well-being was definitely not looked after in that situation, through no one's fault. I mean, hindsight gives you 20/20 vision, I suppose. But definitely having difficult conversations with families, you've got to ensure you maintain your professional boundaries and your professional distancing to safeguard your well-being, and gauge your family's willingness to connect, and what is the response of the collective, where no one educator should be left to deal with it on their own. Think about what supports you have in place as an educator, so that kind of thing would not occur for you too.
Yeah, look, I think I agree that about professional boundaries that you're talking about there, Shona, and I think that professional boundaries can be supported by using the BETLS tool too. And I was just reflecting on actually what would have happened if they'd had that opportunity. Because certainly conversations with families about children's behaviour can be difficult, and documented observations can be a really good starting point for these discussions.
Yeah.
And really just supportive of those meetings. Sorry, Marie, I shall go back to you because you've got the results from the poll here now.
The poll are in.
Yeah, so the poll results are in, and we've got being prepared is at the highest at 88%, and that's where the BETLS observation tool can really support that preparedness and having that documentation there. But also those professional boundaries, as Shona discussed, having a debrief with an appropriate person, and those self-care and mindfulness strategies. Yeah. Panelists, did you want to talk anything more to those results or the conversation around wellbeing?
It's interesting to see the self-care strategies has a low percentage there.
Yeah.
We're not thinking,
right.
not feeling like we're able to think about ourselves, like the impact on our own well-being. But perhaps it's because people are prepared, so they don't feel like they need to use those self-care strategies. Like maybe those two results are linked.
I think that's a really valid point as well, Nikki, because I mean preparation's great, isn't it? And that preparation could include those self-care strategies, I guess, even in terms of thinking about, well, afterwards, who am I going to talk to about this, and how and where I'm going to do it, and how am I going to do it and maintain confidentiality and professionalism as well. So I think
as well part of that preparedness. Sorry,
Mm.
Sandy, speaking over the top of you.
I think
as well, I think about that preparedness for me, part of that would always be around, would sort of, accommodate all those other options that we had on the poll. But it would also be about, and because of that, it would be about me checking in with my intention. Intention to me is such a big word. So, I think about it when I think, why would I use the BETLS tool? What's my intention professionally? So I'd be the same when I went into a conversation is, what's my intention? Oh, well, my intention is to share what I've noticed about the child's experience. Like it's not about, or what I think the child is experiencing, and what I think is happening. So, because I think there's a fine line between maintaining professional boundaries and being able to be really clear that our intention is grounded in care and compassion.
Yeah.
To my, and I don't think that's unprofessional to be clear in your conversation that this is coming from a place of, me wanting to understand your child, and how therefore to meet their need. So, sometimes we don't need to be so cut and dried, and that's why the beauty of this tool is that it brings us in. So we're able to say, I'm doing this because I really care, and I'm not 100% sure, so I really need to engage with you about it. So I think knowing your intention clearly before you step into those moments is also protective, because you're like, I'm professional, I'm doing this out of good intention.
Look, I agree, and I think that the BETLS tool does really demonstrate that that you do really care about the child, and that what you've been doing, and that you've been really giving it a lot of thought as well. And
yeah, it's so thorough, isn't it? Such a thorough tool.
And I think many families will recognise really the care and concern that you've taken about it as well.
Yeah.
And for other families, maybe they may be in a different space at the time, and not in a space to actually be able to discuss it, or have other reasons that they don't want to actually have that discussion at that time too.
Yeah, true.
Thank you. So, for today's webinar, Behaviour and Wellbeing, we explored how a child or young person's behaviour might indicate a concern with mental health and wellbeing. Why observing children and young people deepens our understanding of their behaviour, and how the BETLS observation tool can support educator wellbeing. So I'm going to ask the panellists one last question each for today. I'll start with Shona. Shona, what's your takeaway message from today?
I think for me today, it's important to use a consistent tool when recording examples of concerning or disruptive behaviours or positive behaviours, and that more than one person should, be assisting and taking those observations to avoid any stress or anxiety for educators, especially when those difficult, professional conversations have to occur. That preparedness, but it's really important for educators to look after their own well-being in all aspects of their work. However, at times when emotions may become heightened, it's particularly significant, especially around about now when we have the pandemic situation, and we've had the bushfires where people out with the childcare service, the parents and other support services may be feeling that stress too.
Thank you, Shona. And Sandy, how about yourself?
Just simply recognising the value of observation, that it can really help us to look at what's going on for a child with new eyes and a new understanding of their behaviour. So not necessarily trying to change behaviour is the ultimate goal. And that if you change your approach, you can feel different about your interaction with a child and really get a greater sense of what the child is doing, a bit like blowing cobwebs off your eyes, really. And I think that idea that when you become in tune with a child, it really can be inspirational.
And
lovely.
Nikki, Nikki,
I love
that
that phrase. I carry that with me wherever I go, the idea of blowing cobwebs off my eyes. It's a really beautiful analogy, because I think once again, obviously we're here to champion the BETLS tool because we believe in it so much. But I think that's genuinely, what its intention is to remind us to keep looking and keep thinking and keep sharing and keep reflecting. And it sort of reminds me of that, to just to reframe or to see it again, in a fresh way, or especially if we're feeling challenged as educators, that we can take a moment to be mindful, to blow the cobwebs off our eyes and think, is this an assumption I'm bringing? How do I know this? And take it to someone else. But so sorry, that was my response to Sandy's takeaway. But my takeaway as well is, there's so many things, but mine is to, I just wanted to remind educators out there that we're entitled to joy in our work. I think sometimes we can forget that actually it's okay for us to want to feel good at work, to have a good sense of well-being at work, and that doesn't mean that there won't be days that are hard and that we're working incredibly hard physically and emotionally, but actually we get that sense of joy that needs in us are met around being professionals and enjoying our work. And I think that's more likely to happen when we feel really confident and skilled and capable. And that's why the BETLS tool is so beautiful, because I am not a systems person, and anyone who's ever worked with me before will know. So I tend to keep things in my head and my heart, and you can't really share that. It becomes really difficult if you've noticed something, you've wondered about a child, and it sort of sits in here. It's really valid, but until you put it somewhere where it's shareable, and it can become, you know, a foundation for reflection with others, you know, it means that I'm not making the best use of, you know, the great things that sit in here. So for me, that's a big part of the joy in my work, is to be able to take those things that I know and that I feel and that I'm thinking, and put them in a shareable format, so that I can, you know, see what my colleagues think. You know, what were you thinking? How did it look for you? What would you do differently next time? How are we going to meet this need? Yeah, and to that mind, it's, you know, children are always help seeking, and so are we as adults. It's actually totally appropriate for us to be able to seek help through our observations. I need some help to articulate, to understand, to you know, dig deeper into my observations. So seek help, because you're entitled to it.
Thank you, Shona, Sandy and Nikki. They were lovely anecdotes. My last takeaway message would be that the BETLS tool not only has the power to support the individual child, but it also has the power to nurture whole learning communities as well. So thank you for participating today. When you exit, you'll be prompted to complete the exit survey. Please remember to complete this, and please include the names of anyone that might be watching it with you. As many of you know, these webinars are great ways to not only learn, reflect, and put learning into action. They also assist in demonstrating our individual commitment to continued professional development with BU. They also guide that whole service or school professional learning and continuous improvement. So you can contact our team today and we can assist you. For anyone whose service or school are already participating, please contact your BU consultant. If your service or school isn't a registered participating service as yet, and you would like to know more about what is involved, check out our How to Start the Experience and join today. You can see the link in the chat to get started. You can also join one of our many national check-in events and talk about what you have learnt and done today. Often consultants spot really great learning and action that's being done without educators noticing, and it's often easier for a pair of outside eyes and ears to notice. So once again, thank you for your time.